1869, the completion of the first transcontinental railway in America. The opening of the Suez Canal in Egypt in the same year. And finally, the linking of the Indian railways across the subcontinent in 1870. After these three technological breakthroughs occurred, the idea of making a tourist-like journey around the world became a reality. It was another notable mark in the end of an age of exploration and the start of an age of fully global tourism that could be enjoyed in relative comfort and safety.
In 1870, the Erie Railway Company published a statement of routes, times, and distances detailing a trip around the globe of 23,739 miles in 77 days and 21 hours. But that took little regard for accidents and other unexpected incidents along the way that could delay the trip significantly. In 1871 appeared Around the World by Steam via Pacific Railway, published by the Union Pacific Railroad Company, and Around the World in 120 Days by Edmund Plunkett. The date is now October 2nd, 1872. During an argument with your friends at the Reform Club, you claimed that with the opening of a new railway section in India, it is now possible to make a journey around the world in 80 days or less. Questioning your sanity, your friends accept a wager for your claim of 20,000 British pounds. You're due back at the Reform Club 80 days later on December 21st, 1872. You bring your remaining 20,000 pounds along with you. Your adventure starts now.
We'll take you around the world in 80 days in an educational tour. You begin in your hometown, London, England. During this time period, London became the largest and most populous metropolitan area in the world, and trade within the British Empire was prestigious. This meant that the British currency, the pound, was being accepted all over the world, and that the English were among the wealthiest there were. One of the reasons for Britain's success was the Industrial Revolution, which started in the 18th century. The country gradually went from hand production methods to new chemical manufacturing and iron production processes, the increasing use of steam power, and the development of machine tools. The Industrial Revolution had a tremendous effect on people's lives. Prior to the revolution, industries had mostly been small-scale, with people working in their own homes. Spinning, for example, had mostly been done by women at home, and weavers were most often men, but would also work in their own homes. The Industrial Revolution meant that people were pouring into towns to work in large factories. Towns grew vastly in size. At the end of the 18th century, 75% of the population of England lived in the countryside, and by the end of the 19th century, 75% lived in towns. And because they had so much money in their hands, the British were avid gamblers. Your wager attracted public attention, and now many Londoners are betting for and against the success of your trip.
At 8:45 p.m., you board a train and steamer to Suez and arrive accordingly to your schedule, which takes 7 days. You step on Egyptian soil and take a look around. Although Egypt's influence on European history dates back more than 5,000 years, at the beginning of the 19th century, it was still a mysterious and relatively unknown place to the Europeans. One reason was that Egypt was Muslim and Europe was Christian, and the bitterness created during the Crusades and later wars did not facilitate open communication. Another reason was that most knowledge of ancient Egyptian society had been lost some time before the Greeks occupied the coast, so even though many people had seen the pyramids, temples, and hieroglyphics, no one knew their origin or purpose. During the 19th century, Egypt was largely influenced by Europeans, in particular the British.
Under Ismail the Magnificent, who ruled from 1863 to 1879, the Egyptian debt rose from £3 million to nearly £100 million, largely due to Ismail's efforts to modernize Egypt. Take into consideration how much a pound was worth at the time. He invested heavily in industrial and economic development, urbanization, and the expansion of the country's boundaries in Africa. His philosophy can be understood through a statement that he made in 1879. "My country is no longer in Africa. We are now a part of Europe. It is therefore natural for us to abandon our former ways and to adopt a new system adapted to our social conditions." Britain's main interest was in stabilizing the region, while British merchants tried to find business opportunities in the Nile Valley and Suez. For Egypt, interest was piling up, and actual economic production and resulting revenue were insufficient toward repaying the loans. The British realized that the Egyptian economy was breaking down and finally took over.
Traveling from Suez to Bombay, India, you take a steamer across the Red Sea and Indian Ocean, which takes a total of 13 days. Upon landing in India, you notice that the majority of the population is of Indian descent, but you can also see the domination of European merchants along the shore. India has always been a trading center for the British Empire, as it allowed them to connect with the silks and spices that came from the Orient and was a place that merchants frequented. It was around this time that India began really settling into its modern age. Previously, both the economic and non-economic aspects of India were largely controlled by the East India Company, an arm of the British administration.
Lord Dalhousie became its Governor-General in 1848 and began to establish technological changes such as railways, canals, and the telegraph, which were essential for a modern state. However, the Indian people soon became dissatisfied with some of the company's decisions, such as abandoning much of India's own culture, and finally started the Indian Rebellion of 1857.
This led to the dissolution of the East India Company, and the direct administration of India was then taken over by the British government. As a safeguard for future unrest, the new rulers protected Indian princes and proclaimed the British-style parliamentary system as limited. The city of Bombay, which is now known today as Mumbai, has historically been fought over because of its access to the Silk Road, and this led to the British constructing the Bombay Castle, a huge defensive structure in the city that also houses the governor's house.
Because of its trade significance, the establishment of quite a lot of infrastructure was prioritized here. In fact, the first railway in India was constructed between Thane and Bombay.
All aboard the train to Calcutta, a city in East India, which is a mere 3 days by rail. While construction has been going on at a rapid pace in India, there are still many areas of track that have not yet been constructed.
One of the main methods of transportation through the jungle would have been elephants. In India, elephants are treated as prize animals and are used in many aspects of their lives.
Oh look, a party of religious clergymen. Say what? Our elephant rider says that a beautiful woman is to be sacrificed by the Suti tribe in a religious ceremony so that she can be with her husband. How barbaric. We must save her. Look, it's the temple where they're keeping her. I'll dig a hole in the wall around back while you scare them by pretending to be from the underworld.
Her name is Auda. It turns out she was drugged with opium and hemp, so obviously she wasn't going voluntarily. Her husband was even from a forced marriage. This kind of behavior was a common and prominent Indian stereotype that the Europeans thought to be true and widespread at the time.
The English believed that Hinduism was a barbaric and uncivilized religion and felt like it was their duty to enlighten them to what a real religion was, essentially Christianity.
We've now arrived in Calcutta and are about to board the steamer to Hong Kong. Hopefully, Auda's cousin will be there.
13 days later, you disembark your steamer and step into Hong Kong.
The first thing that hits you is the sheer amount of people milling about in every direction. There are numerous merchant booths and flea markets that have all manners of strange roots and vegetables.
Opium became a major issue in Chinese port cities because of its addictive nature, and that the English aggressively traded this with the Chinese. Opium dens began to rise in number in cities such as Hong Kong.
Opium is a drug that is produced from the latex of opium poppy and is a narcotic. It was originally introduced to the Chinese when the British seeked items such as silk and spices. It was the main driving force of the trade because it was one of the few products that the Chinese people would trade for. Of course, the Chinese administration had a huge issue with the Europeans drugging their people. By 1838, 40,000 chests of opium were being imported annually to China, as opposed to the 200 chests just a century before. A growing number of Chinese people were becoming addicted to this drug. Not to mention silver was quickly being drained, so the emperor demanded action. China destroyed the opium and arrested the merchants, which essentially led to the First Opium War in 1839 and later the Second Opium War in 1856. Victory was given to the Europeans. Southern Kowloon and Hong Kong were ceded to the British, and that's how Hong Kong became a British colony until 1997. Now, the influence of the English was prominent around the world, But why would they be selling opium to the Chinese? The Europeans always loved international trade, and when they came to China, the first trade that existed was for porcelain, silks, and most lucratively, tea. British demand for tea created a huge financial deficit. There was a very low demand for European goods, and the only commodity that the Chinese accepted was silver. This basically urged the British to begin shipping opium to China from its colonies in India using the East India Company. It was a great economic strategy, but it may have denied ethics a little bit.
Several days of rocking back and forth on a small boat eventually takes you to Yokohama.
This huge port city in Japan has a unique oriental style of architecture with many low-rise buildings. The buildings are that of typical Japanese architecture and are divided into 18 wards, or districts.
After the Meiji Restoration, where imperial rule was restored under the Meiji Empire of 1868, the port was developed for trading silk, the main trading partner being Great Britain. As such, Yokohama continues to evolve as a trading port.
Just up until the end of the Edo period, Japan maintained a policy of national seclusion, where they tried to have as little contact with the outside world as possible. But 1853 was a major turning point in Japanese history. Commodore Matthew Perry, with a fleet of American warships, arrived south of Yokohama and politely forced Japan to open numerous ports for trade. Subsequent similar treaties by Britain and other European countries brought economic and political crisis to Japan. The shogun resigned, which led to the Boshin War and the establishment of Imperial Japan under Emperor Meiji, called the Meiji Restoration. This new empire adopted British judicial, political, and military concepts, which allowed Japan to widen its influence and raise its population from 35 million in 1873 to 70 million in 1935. Unfortunately, doing so involved military conflicts such as the Russo-Japanese War and the Sino-Japanese Wars. The journey from Yokohama to San Francisco in the United States takes 22 days.
San Francisco started as a Spanish colony, but was acquired by the Mexicans and then US in 1848. San Francisco then prospered under a gold rush.
The United States was also initially a British colony, but declared independence long ago after the American Revolution in 1776. Before that, the Native American people occupied North America until Christopher Columbus's ships landed in the Bahamas. But let's take a look at the 19th century. The relationship between the federal and many state governments was in turmoil. Abraham Lincoln, candidate of the Republican Party, which was largely anti-slavery, was elected president in 1860. However, just before he took office, 7 slave states declared their secession from the rest of the country and created the Confederate States of America. Clearly, slavery was a big deal. And there we have it, the American Civil War. With the deaths of 620,000 soldiers, it remains the deadliest conflict on American soil. The Union, backed by Lincoln, declared victory and slavery was abolished. And fortunately for our trip, it spurred the steel industry and transcontinental railway construction.
We'll now be taking a 7-day train trip from here to New York. Along the Great Salt Lake in Utah, there lies a Mormon colony. The most prominent and perhaps infamous characteristic of the Mormon religion would be their belief in polygamy, aka plural marriage. Also, train delays in the Midwest were frequent, and some of them are caused by herds of bison crossing the track, a force so powerful that oftentimes trains were forced to stop and wait for the bison to pass. Bison was a major animal that the Native Americans depended on for their very survival. Native Americans were also a significant threat to the railroads, as they often performed daring raids in attempts to reclaim their land. This was a time filled with stories of bravado and train heists where entire fortunes could disappear in the blink of an eye. We finally arrived in New York, and today you can see the Statue of Liberty watching over the port of Manhattan. The Statue of Liberty was designed by Frederick Auguste Bartholdi and given to the United States by the French as a symbol of liberty and freedom in 1886.
Taking a steamer and a train for 9 days, we're finally back in London, England. But we've missed our deadline. All those delays must have added up. Oh, However, it turns out that we actually gained a day traveling east, meaning that we were actually a day early. This was thanks to the Greenwich Time Meridian, which was established in the 19th century but was only internationally accepted in 1884. Now, since you've made it around the world just at the deadline of December 21st, you've won your wager with your friends at the Reform Club. Congratulations! You've earned £20,000!
Oh wait, didn't we just spend £20,000 on that trip? Well, even though you didn't really profit financially, you had the experience of a lifetime. You've taken the hand in marriage of Aouda, that girl you saved in India, and of course, most importantly, you've been educated in world history and British influences in the 19th century.
But what about the present? Let's take a look. Britain, Egypt, India, China, Japan, and the United States. Britain is no longer the greatest power in the world today, but still holds substantial influence economically and diplomatically. English remains the universal language, and they still really enjoy tea. Egypt is now one of the best tourist destinations in the world. Even though in recent years there's been a bit of political action, they have a great diversified economy and one of the largest populations in Africa. Now, India has long passed the days of the East India Company and total control by the British administration, and is now rapidly improving the conditions of its people. It is now a booming democracy and has the third largest gross domestic product by purchasing power parity. China has regained Hong Kong. They've abandoned the dynasties and are now well into the Great Leap Forward. So much of the world's consumer goods are manufactured in China, like maybe your shoes, pencils, and even phones. It is predicted that in around 10 years, China will surpass the United States economically. Now, where would you go if you wanted the latest gadgets, cherry blossoms, and stuff like this? Japan has also seen rapid economic development, which is only slowing in recent years, and is now one of the most technologically advanced countries in the world. Tokyo holds the record for being the most populated and most expensive city in the world to live in.
And what about going around the world? 80 days? No, you could accomplish this in under 48 hours. And let's look at the future. What do we have in store?
Good question. Spaceships, virtual reality, teleportation, and maybe, just maybe, a better can opener. Stay tuned for Around the Universe in 80 Days.